Oh, hey Bio20s. Hopefully everyone's hanging in there. Today, we are going to start a new unit and get into Unit A. So I'm going to go through a little bit of Chapter 1, talking about the Biosphere, and then into Chapter 2, talking about food chains and food webs. So, let's get into it. When we talk about the Biosphere, we want to think of an ecosystem as a system. And a system can go through various changes or fluctuations. And how that system reacts to these changes is very, very important. So we need our ecosystems to be in what's called dynamic equilibrium. This means that the system can undergo changes, but it can adjust to these changes. So let's say the ecosystem gets a little warmer, gets a little colder. We can adjust to these changes without upsetting the whole balance, without completely destroying the ecosystem. And then if an ecosystem cannot adjust to these changes, then we have a pretty big problem. So dynamic equilibrium, being able to adjust to minor, sometimes major changes, but without upsetting the entire system itself. Now, the biosphere is made up of 3 distinct zones. We have the lithosphere, so we can think of L for land, lithosphere, anything living on land. Hydrosphere, anything living in the water, and atmosphere, anything living in the air. So land, water, and air will make up our biosphere. So ecologists will then break down So ecologists will then break down the biosphere into smaller, more manageable groups to study. So we break down our biosphere into groups of ecosystems called biomes. Then we look closer at a biome, we get an ecosystem, which is a community of both its living and non-living components, biotic and abiotic. Then we have a community, which is all these species in a given area. Then we look at that group of the same species, that's a population, and then we narrow it down to, say, an organism. So we put it all together in the big grand scheme of things. Let's say we have an individual or an organism right here. We group individuals of the same species into a population. We then group all the species together into a community, the trees and the moose and the elk and the rabbits. We then add in the non-living components, the water, the rocks, the soil, into an ecosystem. We put multiple ecosystems together to get biomes, and then that's all part of the biosphere, which is once again the lithosphere, hydrosphere, and atmosphere. Okay, now what happens if that what happens if that equilibrium is thrown off in any way? Now we have an unbalanced ecosystem that can really lead to some drastic changes, the most drastic being extinction of a species. So if the ecosystem can't withstand these changes, we make it way too warm in an ecosystem with a lot of ice, and all the ice melts, and now organisms are left trying to deal with these changes, and they can't deal with these changes, they may end up going extinct, like some species out there. I'll throw a crazy stat out here for you. Of all the species that have ever lived on Earth, 99% of them are extinct. And that's not all due to humans, because we haven't been around here that long. But 99% of all species on Earth have gone extinct, which is crazy to think about. Because species, for whatever reason, if an ecosystem changes too far, they could go extinct and then be completely removed from that ecosystem. Now, there are different levels to this, right? There's special concern, there's threatened, there's endangered. You've probably heard of endangered before, so species are in danger of going extinct. There's extirpated, where they're removed from an area but not the world itself, and then extinct means they're no longer on the planet. But sometimes we think a species is extinct and then we find out, oh, there's a little bit left over here. So it's not always a hard and fast rule. Also, species can move up and down. So a species might be close to extinction, but then we bring them back through conservation efforts and things like that. So it's not a guarantee they'll become extinct, but when ecosystems go out of dynamic equilibrium, there's a high chance that some species are going to be in a lot of trouble. Okay, Now what I want to talk about is some species that are particularly sensitive to an ecosystem. We refer to them as indicator species. So a good example of an indicator species are amphibians, because they are found in two parts of the ecosystem. They're found in a tadpole stage in the water, and let's say the frog stage in the terrestrial land. So they're part of two different ecosystems. So if you start seeing frogs or amphibians disappearing, that's a good indicator something's wrong with the ecosystem and it's going out of dynamic equilibrium. Because if there's something wrong with the water, the tadpoles are going to die off, and that's going to lead to less frogs. If there's something wrong with the land and the frogs die off, that's going to lead to less tadpoles. So amphibians, seeing as they're part of two different ecosystems, or two different parts of the ecosystem, can be a good indicator that something might be wrong. It's kind of like a warning that, hey, we need to do something before it's too late. Now, as we dig deeper into ecosystems, we're going to look at food webs and food chains. This is part of chapter 2. So, looking at food webs and food chains, how they interact with each other, we categorize organisms into levels called trophic levels. Trophic comes from the Greek word meaning feeder. So as we kind of go through these levels, we can categorize individuals or organisms into these different levels. So number one, we have the producers and autotrophs in the first trophic level. These would be organisms that can make their own food through photosynthesis, through other means, but they're organisms that generate their own food. Okay? As we move into the second trophic level, we then have our primary consumers. These are consumers that eat producers. So these would generally be our herbivores, organisms that eat producers. Then we have our third trophic level, which contains our secondary consumers. They would rely on energy from primary consumers. So they would generally eat the primary consumers. This would be in the third trophic level. And we can keep going up in trophic levels. However, there is a limit to how large the trophic levels can get, and we'll chat about that in a little bit. Now, differing between autotrophs and heterotrophs, autotrophs, once again, they are able to synthesize their own food from essentially basic ingredients. So for example, we take some sunlight, we take some carbon dioxide, we take some water, and they can synthesize that into glucose through photosynthesis. Heterotrophs cannot make their own food. Humans, wolves, deer, etc. They can't make their own food. So because of that, they need to eat either autotrophs or other heterotrophs to gain the energy that they need. Now, when we look at a food chain is a simple step-by-step sequence of energy flow and who eats who in the ecosystem. So you see that energy goes from the sun to the grass, grasshopper eats the grass, shrew eats the grasshopper, and then owl eats the shrew. It's a sequence of events, or a sequence of who is eating who. One thing to note here, and this is actually quite important that people often forget, the arrows will always show who is doing the eating or where the energy is going. So if you were to put your arrow like this is incorrect, because what this arrow is showing is that the shrew is eating the owl. I can tell you right now, unless that's a really big shrew, it's probably not going to be eating the owl. So we need to make sure our arrows are going in the correct direction when drawing food chains or food webs. Now, tying that back to trophic levels, we notice that the trophic level is kind of tied to how many steps away they are from the sun. First trophic level, 1 step away from the sun. Second trophic level, 2 steps away from the sun. Third and fourth, and so on. So the farther away we get from the sun, the farther away we get in trophic levels. Okay, now when we put food chains together, because let's be honest, shrews will eat more than just grasshoppers, we then get an interlocked web of food chains called a food web. So for example, we have all these organisms interlocked with one another based on what they eat. And organisms can then be categorized. So we have our producers here with our algae and our water weeds. Our primary consumers, slugs, flies, carps, and prawns. So they're going to eat the, autotrophs in the first level. Then we have the trout and the dragonflies forming our secondary consumers, which are located in the third trophic level. Turtle could be in the second or the third, depending on what path you follow. And then we move on to the kingfisher, frog, and snake. depending on, once again, what path you follow. They might follow into the 4th trophic level, or even up there into the 5th trophic level. But a food web is simply putting a bunch of food chains together and showing the actual ecosystem connected in to one another. Finally, the last thing I want to go through is scavengers and decomposers, because sometimes it's hard to fit these into a actual food web. A scavenger, basically they'll eat dead or decaying animals, but they won't actually kill it. So a great example of this is a vulture, right? Vultures will come along, carcass of an animal, it's already been killed, and they'll come along and pick at the carcass, right? They don't actually do the killing, but they'll scavenge and eventually eat some of it. And then a decomposer, while we don't include the decomposers in the actual food web, they are essential to the ecosystem, because what they're doing is whenever something dies, whether it's in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th level, when something dies, a decomposer will break that organism down, get some energy for itself, and then break it down into its simpler organic molecules, which once again will feed the producers, restarting the cycle. And I mean, if you guys have seen Lion King, that whole circle of life, it's true. When things die, their nutrients go back into the soil, which plants can then take up, and the rabbit eats the plants, and the fox eats the rabbit, and the whole cycle continues. But decomposers are essential to that cycle continuing. So that's all I have for you today. Next lesson, we're going to go into the limits of energy transfer. So how much energy is actually transferred each level. And then we're going to go into some ecological models. So how do we actually visually represent different ecosystems? So thanks again for watching, and we will chat soon.